Imagine you just had a baby. You're home now. There's a new baby in the house. You're exhausted. You're barely sleeping. And everybody around you is probably expecting that. You just had a baby. Of course you're tired. But then something starts to change. Maybe you stop sleeping almost completely. Your anxiety gets worse. Maybe start entering your head that scares you. Thoughts you don't want. Thoughts that don't feel like you. Maybe you start questioning things you used to know were real. Maybe you start hearing things that nobody else can hear, and imagine how terrifying that might be. Because here's what I think most people misunderstand. From the outside, you might still look like you. You can have a conversation, you can make lunch, you can hold your baby, you can answer a text message, you can tell somebody that you are okay. But inside your own mind, something is changing, and you know it. There's a condition that causes symptoms like this after childbirth: postpartum psychosis. It's rare, it's serious, and it's a psychiatric emergency. Now, imagine realizing something is happening to your mind. So you ask for help. You tell your husband, you tell your family, you see doctors, you're prescribed medication. Maybe the medication changes, you see another provider. Eventually, you even go to a psychiatric hospital. You're doing what we constantly tell people who are struggling mentally to do: ask for help before something terrible happens. And then something terrible happens. Three children are dead. Their mother killed them. And suddenly the question isn't simply whether there's something wrong with her, it's whether anybody understood how wrong things have become. That's where the story of Lindsay Clancy begins. Because on January 24th, 2023, Lindsay Clancy killed her three children: Cora, Dawson, and Callan. That part isn't disputed. What is disputed is something much harder. What was happening inside Lindsay Clancy's mind when she did it? Prosecutors say she understood exactly what she was doing. They said this was deliberate, planned, premeditated. Her defense says severe mental illness left her unable to be held criminally responsible. And there's another question underneath all that. Because Lindsay wasn't completely isolated before this happened. Her husband knew she was struggling. Her family knew. Doctors knew. She was receiving treatment. She had been hospitalized. So, how did three children still end up dead? And was there a moment somewhere along the way where somebody realistically could have stopped it? That's what I want to understand. And to do that, we have to start with what happened. January 4th, 2023, Duxbury, Massachusetts, Lindsay Clancy was home with her husband Patrick and their three children: 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 8-month-old Callan. That evening, Patrick left the house. He was going to pick up medication for one of the children and get food. While Patrick was gone, Lindsay strangled all three children. Then she went upstairs window and fell to the ground below. When Patrick returned, he found Lindsay outside. He asked what had happened. Lindsay indicated that she had tried to kill herself. Then Patrick asked about the children. They were in the basement. Patrick went downstairs and found all three. Cora and Dawson died that night. Callan died several days later. Lindsay survived her fall but was left paralyzed. She was eventually charged with 3 counts of murder and 3 counts of strangulation. And here's what makes this case unusual: nobody is asking the jury who killed these children. Lindsay's defense acknowledges that she did. The fight is over something else. Was Lindsay Clancy criminally responsible when she killed them? And that question takes a backward, because January 24th wasn't the first indication of something being wrong. Lindsay gave birth to Cal in May 2022. Months later, according to testimony presented during the trial, the mental health began deteriorating. There was anxiety, severe problems sleeping, depression, suicidal thoughts, and disturbing thoughts involving her children. Her family noticed, Patrick noticed, and Lindsay herself knew that something was wrong. She sought treatment, she saw mental health professionals, She was prescribed psychiatric medication. Different medications were tried. Dosages were changed. Providers were changed. Eventually, she was hospitalized, and her family said that she continued getting worse. Her former mother-in-law described Lindsay as begging for help. And then there's a medication history. Over roughly 4 months, Lindsay was prescribed 13 different psychiatric medications through more than 30 prescriptions. Now, before anybody hears that number and runs with it, that does not mean that Lindsay was taking 13 psychiatric drugs at the same time. The available evidence doesn't establish that. Some medications were stopped, others were started. Doses changed. The treatment evolved as providers tried to figure out what was happening. So the number itself doesn't prove malpractice. And it definitely doesn't prove medication caused the killing. But it does show us something important. This was not a woman who had one bad day out of nowhere. Something had been happening for months. And shortly before the killing, the situation became even more serious. Suicidal thoughts, hospitalization, internet searches involving hallucinations, psychosis, postpartum psychosis, medication side effects, and suicide. So by January, the question wasn't whether Lindsay had been struggling. The question was, what exactly was she struggling with? And that's where medicine and law started pulling from different directions. Mental illness doesn't automatically mean not guilty. So before we go any further, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a psychologist. I'm explaining the evidence and the legal and medical questions using the available records, recording the testimony. And there's a distinction we have to understand. Having a serious mental illness doesn't automatically mean that somebody isn't criminally responsible for something they do. Massachusetts law asks whether, because of a mental disease or defect, someone lacking substantial capacity to appreciate the criminality or wrongfulness of their conduct, or lacks substantial capacity to conform their conduct to the requirements of the law. So the jury isn't simply answering, was Lindsay mentally ill? There's substantial evidence that she was experiencing serious mental health problems. The harder question is, what did that illness do to her ability to understand or control what she was doing when she killed her children? And this is where I think the prosecution deserves to be heard seriously, because some of their evidence is difficult for the defense. This is the strongest case against Lindsay. So let's assume for the moment that you are a prosecutor. What does this night even look like? Patrick leaves the house, but he doesn't just randomly decide to leave. Lindsay asks him to go out. He's getting medication, food. That creates a window when Lindsay is alone with all three children. During that window, all three are killed. Prosecutors have to focus on that timeline. They examine her phone, her internet activity, her Apple Watch, her behavior earlier that day, and her ability to perform ordinary tasks. She could communicate, use her phone, make decisions, interact with people, and then there are the healthcare professionals. Several people who treated Lindsay before the killing testified that they did not observe psychosis. That's important. One psychiatrist testified that Lindsay denied hearing voices telling her to hurt herself or someone else. During a hospitali- During a hospitalization shortly before the killing, she was diagnosed with severe depression without psychotic features. So here's the prosecution basic argument. Lindsay was mentally ill, but mental illness doesn't explain everything. They said that she understood what she was doing. She created an opportunity to be alone with the children. She killed them and then attempted suicide. If you're going to argue that Lindsay wasn't criminally responsible, then you have to deal with that evidence. And I do. I think it's significant. But then you run into a problem because the prosecution's argument depends partly on what psychosis is supposed to look like. And psychosis doesn't always look the way that people expect. So, what does psychosis actually look like? Postpartum psychosis isn't another name for postpartum depression. It's much rarer and much more severe. It can involve hallucinations, delusions, paranoia, confusion, disorganized thinking, severe changes in mood, and distorted perceptions of reality. But somebody experiencing psychosis doesn't necessarily look completely disconnected from reality every single second. They can sometimes have conversations, complete ordinary tasks, interact with their family, appear relatively functional. So when prosecutors say, look how organized she looked, the defense has an answer. Organized behavior doesn't necessarily rule out psychosis. Now, the defense has presented testimony from a psychologist who evaluated Lindsay after the killing. He testified that he believed that she experienced psychosis. According to his testimony, Lindsay described hearing a voice telling her to kill the children. That's incredibly important testimony, but it's still testimony. It doesn't automatically make it fact because an expert said it. The prosecution gets to challenge the conclusion. The jury decides how much weight to give it. And there's another distinction that we need to make because this case involves a phrase that gets thrown around a lot: intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts and psychosis aren't necessarily the same thing. An intrusive thought can be unwanted, disturbing. It can be completely contrary to what somebody actually wants to do. Having an intrusive thought about harming somebody doesn't automatically mean you intend to harm them. Psychosis is different now. It can involve genuinely disturbance in someone's perception of reality. That's why simply hearing that Lindsay had disturbing thoughts involving her children doesn't answer the question. What were those thoughts? How did she experience them? Did she want them? Was she afraid of them? Did they change? And did the people treating her understand what was happening? Which brings us to something I think this trial really needs us to examine. Who had the whole picture here? Lindsay wasn't dealing with one doctor. Her treatment involved multiple professionals, different medications, medication changes, hospitalization, different assessments, and different moments. And testimony has raised question about how much information some providers had about what other providers were doing. At least one psychiatric provider acknowledged not having complete information from Lindsay's other providers. She hadn't spoken with Lindsay's other psychiatrists. She hadn't communicated the hospitals involved in Lindsay's care. Now, that does not automatically mean that somebody screwed up. Healthcare can involve multiple specialists from completely legitimate reasons. But when a patient is deteriorating, coordination starts to matter. Who knew what medication she already tried? Who knew how she responded? Who knew about the suicidal thoughts? Who knew about the thoughts involving the children? Who knew what Lindsay's family was seeing at home? And who was responsible for putting all of that together? That's the part that concerns me because we constantly tell people get help, tell somebody, talk to your doctor, go to the hospital, don't suffer alone. Lindsay did many of those things, and something still went catastrophically wrong. So, did the healthcare system fail her? Right now, I don't think that we can say that. Lindsay has filed a civil lawsuit alleging failures by healthcare providers involving in her treatment. Those are allegations. They have to be proven. And there's another inconvenient fact we have to acknowledge. Doctors treating Lindsay before January 24th didn't know three children were going to die. We do. That changed how we see every warning sign. Hindsight can take scattered information and turn it into a giant flashing red light. The question isn't whether the warning signs look obvious now. The question is whether they reasonably should have looked obvious then. And doctors weren't the only people trying to understand what was happening because there was somebody else living in the house with Lindsay. What about Patrick? This is the question people keep asking. And honestly, my wife asked me the same thing. If Patrick knew Lindsay was struggling, why was she alone with the children? That is a fair question. Patrick knew his wife was having serious mental health problems. He testified that she kept getting worse. He knew she'd experienced disturbing thoughts involving the children. And at one point, Patrick himself asked Lindsay whether she thought that she needed to be kept away from the kids. According to Patrick, she said no, and he testified that he never actually seen her hurt them. So think about what Patrick knew at the time. His wife was struggling, but she was also seeking professional help. She had been evaluated. She could still make lunch, put the children to bed, play with them, be their mother. Knowing what happened, it's incredibly easy for us to say that Patrick shouldn't have never left her alone. But that's hindsight again. The harder question is, did Patrick have enough information at the time to reasonably believe that his wife might kill the three children when he left the house? I haven't seen evidence that allows me to confidently say yes. And I haven't found credible evidence supporting internet theories that Patrick secretly killed the children either. Neither the prosecution nor Lindsay's defense is arguing that Patrick killed them. So, unless credible evidence changes that, I'm not turning speculation into a storyline. But Patrick's testimony still leaves us with an important question. If a husband reaches the point where he's asking whether his wife should be separated from their children, who is supposed to make that call? The husband? The patient? The psychiatrist? The hospital? And what information does someone need before saying these children cannot safely be left alone with their mother? Because apparently several people understood that Lindsay was struggling. What nobody seems to have understood was what was coming next. And notice what we've done here. We've talked about Lindsay, her diagnosis, her medication, her doctors, her lawyers, Patrick, the healthcare system, and slowly the three people who actually died have almost disappeared from their own story. So let's bring them back. Cora, 5 years old, Dawson, 3 years, Callan, 8 months. They were not evidence. They weren't a part of a psychiatric debate. They were children. And whatever was happening inside Lindsay's mind, they still died horribly. Understanding her mental illness does not minimize that. And acknowledging what happened to them doesn't require us to ignore evidence of severe mental illness. Both deserve to be taken seriously. So, what do I think? When I started looking into this case, I thought the biggest question was, did postpartum psychosis cause Lindsay Clancy to kill her children? I don't think that's the right question anymore because even that skips too far ahead. I think there are really three separate questions. What was happening inside Lindsay's mind? Was she criminally responsible for what she did? And could anybody reasonably have stopped it? Those questions don't necessarily have the same answer. Maybe Lindsay was profoundly mentally ill and still capable of behavior that appeared organized. Maybe doctors encountered warning signs, but those warning signs weren't nearly as obvious as they appeared now. Maybe Patrick made a decision that seemed unimaginable knowing the ending now, but seemed reasonable based on what he knew at the time. Or maybe when all of the evidence is finally presented, we'll discover that somebody really did miss something that they should have recognized. I don't know yet. The trial isn't finished, so neither is my judgment. But there is one question I think that we should already be asking. Not who else can we blame? Something harder. Where was the last realistic opportunity to stop this? Was it months before the killing when Lindsay's mental health started deteriorating? Was it during one of the medication changes? Was it when she became suicidal? Was it during hospitalization? Was it when disturbing thoughts involving her children appeared? Was it when Patrick wondered whether she should be kept away from them? Or was there generally no moment when anyone could reasonably have predicted what Lindsay Clancy was about to do? Because those possibilities lead to very different conclusions. If someone misses a preventable danger, we need to understand what they missed. If the healthcare system failed, we need evidence showing how it failed. If Lindsay was legally incapable of understanding or controlling what she did, the jury needs evidence establishing that. And if prosecutors are right, that she understood exactly what she was doing, then severe mental illness cannot simply become an explanation that erases responsibility. Whatever the answer is, the evidence has to earn it. Because three children are dead, we cannot change that. But somewhere in the month before Cora, Dawson, and Callan died, there was a moment when you could realistically prevent it. Maybe the most important thing that we can learn from this case is how to recognize that moment the next time before it's too late.